So, as I mentioned just before we took a break, in December I returned to Shasta Abbey, which is a Zen monastery in Northern California. And I will say that at Shasta Abbey, it's both men and women are there. They train there, and both men and women are called monks. And the reason why it's not monks and nuns, and the reason why is because, and I will go into more detail, but there was a recognition that the idea of a nun is sort of second class. So they call everybody monks and nuns. So when I refer to monks, you'll know right now, I'm talking about both men and women. I lived there for a couple of years in the 90s because actually I was exploring and wanted to see if I wanted to become a monk. Now, my life didn't take me in that direction, obviously, but that's another story. So I've returned to the Abbey a few times over the years. It was 22 years ago that I left it in the 90s, a long time ago. I've returned a few times over the years, but in December, I returned for 2 weeks. It's the first time in 12 years that I've been back. So it was really a long time. The visit was beautiful and intense. And I'll just start with the most obvious reason why a visit to Shasta Abbey would be beautiful. It's the mountain. It's right there, the mountain. They're smack in front of the mountain. And the mountain, they're at a 4,000-foot elevation at the Abbey, and the mountain's 12,000 feet. And you look out there, and there it is, like just across the way, which is both good and bad. Like in the winter, the winds are huge. But it's magnificent, snow-covered, and the cloud formations. I mean, just mountain watching is something that you could spend a great deal of time doing. And then I had what felt to me a little bit of a personal experience because when I lived there, there was an avalanche one night. Woke up in the morning, my window when I was there looked right out into the mountain, and I could see that there was a new path. It looked like an upside-down Y. It came down the mountain, and then it kind of bifurcated, and all of a sudden it was covered with snow where there had been trees. And by golly, it is still there, still covered with snow, still no trees on that path. And I don't know, it kind of felt like a personal connection with the mountain. Like, don't we look for personal connections wherever we go, like something we recognize? So I did. I found as I went to the Abbey, as I was there in December, that there's a lot of it that is extremely difficult. I'm not going to talk right now about the workload. It's intense. The workload is there. Keeping up the monastery and maintaining it is a lot of work, and they do that. And also is the health aspect. At 4,000 feet, if you have a little bit of a weakness in your breath, what breathing I did, you feel it. But most of all, what I noticed was I slipped quite naturally, I felt, into the spirit of the monastic life, something I've known before and lived in before. And I was just interested, more than interested. It's just kind of a natural gliding into it. Many of the monks that I'd known before were still there, and I was greeted with, as kind of like a member of the family. It felt really good. It was just beautiful to be back. It felt so natural. I think that life in a Zen monastery is a fairly exotic topic. It's not like we talk about that every time we get together. So I thought that what I would do tonight is I'd like to talk about some aspects, personal aspects of my visit, but also weaving in how the approaches of a Zen monastery, which are in some ways very different from what we know, and yet resonate with our own mindfulness practice profoundly. It's not like it's apples and oranges. There are profound resonance. So I'd like to discuss some of the experiences I had and some of the resonance that's there. It's kind of going to be a ramble tonight. It's not going to be a neat little talk. But first of all, some of the monks that are there have been there for 30 years or more. I mean, a long time. Their sincerity in their training on this path of awakening is just blows me away. It's just amazing. And I will say These people are the most refined group of people I know. And I mean refined in the sense of who they are, their being, not in our usual way of when we think about refinement, we think about what? Placement of knives and forks and sophistication. No, in another way, about just who they are. You know, they have a different attitude. Of course, they're human. I'm not going to in any way say they're not imperfect. All of us are human. They are too. And yet they have a different way of kind of being. They don't have to fill the space with talk. And yet when in their non-talking, or in their relative non-talking, I'm not saying they're silent because they're not. This is not a silent order. But what they say has a lot of meaning, and what they don't say has a lot of meaning. It's just both ways. You pick up, one picks up, I do, as a layperson who's been there, on small gestures and on silences, things that often bypass us. Very subtle things, just small gestures. They have a quality that that isn't often found in many people, I would say. So I'd say, what is it? I've tried to think of the words to put to it. I'd say both they're respectful, and at the same time, they're humble. You know, they're not trying to show you how great they are. In fact, what strikes you is that they don't have anything to prove. They're not trying to prove anything to you. Like, wow. You know, they're not trying to get a word in edgewise or none of that. They're just being there. And they are listening. You know, it's the practice. For many of us, you know, we think, oh, my practice, well, it didn't go so well this week. You know, I only meditated once, not at all, 3 times, whatever it is, you know, and not so well. For them, their practice is not just meditation. That's just one little facet. Their lives are their practice, and they embody it in their lives without any big to-do about it. And I couldn't help, as I was trying to think of their attitude, I came across, there's a verse from the Dhammapada, which is not Zen, it's in our tradition. It's an ancient Buddhist text, something the Buddha said. And he said, an untroubled mind, no longer seeking to consider what is right and what is wrong, a mind beyond judgments, watches and understands. A mind beyond judgment watches and understands. And I think a good word, a synonym for watches, is sees. It's not just passive watching. We can get that idea. And I'd also like to say that beyond right and wrong, that doesn't consider what is right and what is wrong, that's not that anything goes. I hope we understand that. That is, they so much embody what's right and wrong. It's not a question, you know, and they're not judging others. Oh, look what they transgressed, they didn't do this, they didn't do that. No, it's simply they're present, they're watching, they're being, and they understand so much. In fact, it's seeing and understanding. You I feel seen when you're there. And this is both good news and it can be bad news. You know, the good news is a lot of times we don't feel seen, like who we are isn't really seen. And that's nice when you're seen. And on the other hand, you know, sometimes we really, you know, all those little quirks that you've got and you'd really rather not have them seen, they're seen. You know, it's like, oh, right. You know, and especially at a monastery, if you're at a monastery and you're really trying to be, well, do it right, you know. And then there's this little flash maybe of anger, or maybe a little bit of greed, or a little bit of jealousy. Boy, you know, not just so much that it's seen, you see yourself. Like, it's amazing. You know, you can't hide. There's no place to hide in such a circumstance. Isn't that interesting? Here we can, you know, tell ourselves stories, and besides that, nobody's paying much attention anyway, usually, unless they're there to judge you, and, you know, then we're antagonistic and blah, 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 blah. The story goes on. There it just is. And in this space of what is, you see yourself. You see yourself. So my experience is being with the monks there. The experience is, I feel that I deepen, I become deeper. And I remember feeling that so much, especially right after when I came home And I don't know if it's worn off, but I don't know. It's not quite the same feeling as time wears on. I feel deeper and more content. And I'm not saying that all of them are content, because believe me, they're not. You go through periods of real hardship if you're a monk. This is not an easy path. We won't go into that right now because I have other things I want to tell you. I'm hoping there's going to be time at the end for a few questions if you want to ask, because this is kind of, I don't know, informal tonight. So it's said that the quality of a teacher can be seen in the quality of his or her students. And this is so much the case. The quality of it was a woman who established Shasta Abbey, the abbess, I think is seen in the quality of her monks. I think it's a tremendous testimony to who she was. She was an English woman. Her name was Margaret Kennett, and her religious name, they all are given a religious name, was Jiu. I don't remember what it means, but it's Japanese for something nice. I don't remember what it is. Jiu Kennett. And once she became the abbess, she was addressed, all of the monks are addressed as reverend. I mean, they are ordained and they're clergy. But the person who is the abbot she was addressed as Reverend Master. So she was Reverend Master Jiu. So I'm going to be referring to her at different times as Reverend Master Jiu or just Reverend Master. You'll know who I'm talking about when I do that. She had trained at a Japanese monastery in the 1960s. And by the 70s, she was here in the States. And she taught Buddhism for a while at one of the universities in California in the 60s, later 60s, and early 70s. And those of us, at least us with gray hair, will remember that the 70s were a time of great idealism. You know, it really was a very different feeling amongst young people. There was just a lot of idealism then. Margaret Kennett had a charismatic personality, and she attracted to her a lot of idealistic young men and young women. And these are people who became her students, and then they became her disciples. Many of them ordained as monastics and became disciples. So I thought, what I ought to say is that, you know, this was a time in the 70s when Zen was in. You know, it's kind of like mindfulness now. Mindfulness is in, and everything is about mindfulness, right? A lot of us know that. At that time, in the 70s and the 80s, Zen was the big thing. So she attracted a rather large number of idealistic young people who ordained. I thought I'd start, and I wanted to tell you something about the physical setup of the monastery, because I think when we try to envision what's a monastery like, you know, either we pull up ideas about a medieval monastery in Europe, you know, enormous and stone and dark and big dark spaces, or else if you're thinking of a Japanese monastery, you might think, well, you know, this perfectly positioned pieces of furniture and a little flower in a, you know, alcove or something like that, very aesthetic. Well, Shasta Abbey is nothing at all like that. It's very functional. In fact, Jiu Kennett didn't go for the Japanese aesthetic at all. And she was a very practical woman. And so the monastery reflects that in a big way. Beautiful, it is not. You know, it's not the point. Originally, first of all, it's in a rural mountainous area. Originally, when Jiu Kennett looked for the land, and she did in the 70s, early 70s, she found this beautiful piece of land right across from, well, you could say right across, right in the proximity of Mount Shasta. And it was for sale. And the reason why it was for sale is because it had been a motel in earlier days, and the motel went bust. And the reason why it went bust is because originally it had been right off of major roads out of the beautiful little town of Mount Shasta, but then I-5, the highway that goes from Canada to Mexico, was built over many years, and Mount Shasta was kind of left high and dry. There wasn't an exact exit, and the monastery couldn't make it. I mean, the motel couldn't make it. So she bought this land, and It had on it some little stone buildings that are really extraordinary. They were built by some master stonemasons. If any of you have been to California and have been to San Simeon, that was the Hearst estate, maybe some of you have, built by the same people, those little stone houses that were there. But you can't run a monastery from little stone houses. And so what Giukenna did and what her monks did after that was they built buildings, major buildings, a meditation hall, a kitchen, a dining hall, and so forth, that they could actually run the monastery from. I will say right now, I just mentioned I-5 and the interstate, and it still, of course, runs past Shasta Abbey. You can't see it because of the lay of the land. The Abbey's up, the interstate is down, and what you see of the lands goes up to the mountains. But you hear it. You don't see a thing, but you hear it all the time. There are always cars passing, and the monks call it the river of life, was what they call it. It's really interesting because when lay people come, they're people who can be really irritated. I've seen that when I was there, really irritated by this noise that's always there. It's very interesting. Mindfulness practice. You can either let it irritate you, and some people did, or else you can just say, there it is, and you it stops being a bother. So it's the river of life. So I'm going to mention the interstate again in a few minutes, so that's why I'm kind of highlighting it now. So talking about the monastery, it's built, it's all enclosed in a chain link fence, not lovely, and it is built in an oval pattern. At one end are the public buildings in what is now a guest house, and down at the other end, private buildings, that's where the monks are, and all the way in between are the buildings that they need for the monastery. There's a ceremony hall, a dining hall, a kitchen, a maintenance building, and so forth. And then the monks run their little offices. Anybody has a little office, lives in one of those, has an office in the stone building. It's not where they live, but it's in the office in the stone building. And I will just say in the last 15 years, a few beautiful places have been built too, because there was a monk there who had been, a builder, and he did some beautiful embellishments, but they're just embellishments on the basis of a very functional place. Many of the monks who built the abbey were tall. That is 6 feet or more. And the reason why I mention that, because if you live there, as I did, it's a constant irritation. They built everything high. So you always have to stand on your tiptoe. For them, it was just natural sight to reach anything. And the upper shelves, you have to forget it. You have to get a ladder. So this is, just the way things are there. It's just like the river of life. You just accept that, okay, it's going to be like that. This oval, I said it's an oval, everything in an oval, surrounds a common area that's filled with trees and evergreens. And there are Douglas fir and sugar pine, that are both of which are so much taller than anything I've ever seen around here as evergreens. And the sugar pines have these, Doug fir have just really little pine cones, but the sugar pine cones are at least a foot or longer. So, you kind of got to watch. In the fall, when they start falling, you really want to watch them. They're like missiles coming down. But they're amazing. So they're in this central area, and the central area is covered with pine cones and branches. It's an area you might want to crisscross on foot, but it's not a place to stretch out and enjoy nature. It's just functional. It's there, and it's got the compost heap and other things. So that's the way that is. There's a cloister there, and I feel a good deal to say about the cloister. Cloister is a walkway, and the cloister there links all the buildings in the oval. It links all the buildings in the oval. It is all the way up and down it. It is covered with a tin roof. Again, it's not beautiful. And the outer side is walled off with tin, whatever you call it, siding. So the effect of that is, first of all, it's not beautiful, and second of all, you can't see the mountain when you're on the cloister. You want to see the mountain, you can't, it's all blocked off. What you do is you look into the inside, to the inner part, and I think it is a metaphor for practice. Do you see? looking inward. Looking inward. I think this was the point of that. The cloister is lined with stacks of wood because there are furnaces. Buildings are heated with furnaces, and in the winter you really need them. Stacks of wood and boxes of tinder, all up and down the cloister on the inside. So this is what you see as you walk around. You know, there's a Zen saying that Zen people chop wood and carry water. That's it. And although they don't do much carrying of water, because it's piped in, of course, they do a lot of chopping of wood. And then the stoking of furnaces. It's a big job there. And I would like to tell you for a few minutes about the black line that's on the cloister. It's like a 4-inch black line that's been painted on the cloister, and I tell you about it because I was on the team 23 years ago that painted it. And the reason why it was painted, it goes all the way around, on the upper side. I don't know about down on the monastic side. On the upper side, it links all the buildings right smack down the middle. And the reason why that is because Jiu Kennet, the abbess of the monastery by the 1990s, was very sick. She was in a wheelchair, she was partly blind and partly paralyzed. And one of the monks, it was actually a controversial idea at the time, had the idea that they ought to paint this line right down the middle of the cloister so she would be able to get out on her own and go down to the ceremony hall and so forth. So a whole team of us did that. It was a big effort to paint. It was about one brush width, about 4 inches. And it was a big effort. I don't know if she ever used it, but I will say, in a way, it was fun. And we joked about it, those of us on that team, because we talked about, if people came by as tourists and wondered what were before we painted, we had to kind of scrub the cloister to make sure that there was nothing sticking there so the paint would adhere. So we said, if tourists came by and wondered what we were doing, we would tell them that we were being punished for breaking the rules. Why were we scrubbing the cloister? It's like... So this line goes all the way down, and then there's one point, and I would just mention this briefly. I know this sounds like trivia, but when I got there this time, it made a difference. There's one place where the line has to veer off to go to the ceremony hall. Well, I did that. I did it freehand. And I remember this time, I looked at it and I felt this, wow, it's so good. Isn't it? It's really funny the way we respond to things. I mean, this is 23 years ago. And so anyway, that's the cloister. Talking about Jiu Kennet, going back to her, and her experiences in the Japanese monastery when she was there in the 60s. She was the first and only woman in that monastery. And in the 60s, the Japanese, to begin with, as a culture, they're not good at diversity. They're a homogeneous culture. Still aren't good at diversity, but then they really weren't good at diversity. And even today, people who kind of deviate are quickly kind of told what their place should be. Well, Margaret Kennet really stood out as a woman and a Westerner, the only one in the monastery. And I'll say another part of her hardships that she experienced in the monastery was the patriarchy. It's not just Japanese. It goes back to ancient Buddhism. And that is, there was a downplaying in Buddhism as there was culturally in those cultures, giving women a second or nowhere place. It was in ancient Buddhism too, and some of you know the story. I'll just very briefly say it. The Buddha historically allowed women to be nuns in his tradition, and that's back 400s BC. It was incredibly radical to do that. He lived in a patriarchal culture, and he knew when he reluctantly, I won't go into the whole story, I've told it other times, he knew that there would be a huge problem as a result of this, but he did it anyway. Why? Because he said women can attain enlightenment as well as men. I mean, he was pressed to agree. It wasn't that he volunteered this, but one of Ananda, his chief attendant, said, can't women attain enlightenment? And he said, well, yeah. And so finally what they were accepted, but women as nuns in the Buddhist time were given several precepts, several rules that they had to obey that the monks did not. Women had, 331 rules, monks had 227. And some of these rules were really difficult for the women. So I'm just saying that really quickly. In the Buddhist time, it's a very complicated picture, but one thing to remember was what he did was radical, and he was trying to kind of forestall huge uprising because women were being allowed. At any rate, so it plays right into the patriarchy of the cultures, which comes back to the Zen tradition. It's quite different in Zen, especially nowadays. I would like to say this, in Buddhism these days, and especially in the West, that patriarchy is not the big issue it is or was in Asia, and certainly not historically. It's very, very different. But there are remnants. And in the Zen culture, you can see one of the remnants in the chanting of the ancestral lineage. In the Zen tradition, and at Shasta Abbey, for example, everyone knows what their lineage is, and that is the masters in their lineage back to the Buddha. And at Shasta Abbey, every morning in morning services, which they have, they chant the names of their masters back to the Buddha. In fact, before the Buddha, according to the Zen tradition, there were 6 Buddhas before the Buddha, the historical Buddha. So don't ask who they were, because I asked at one point, nobody seems to know. It's legendary. But those names are chanted every morning, and then they get down, and all of these are chanted. In the Shasta Abbey tradition, there are 85 names, 85 masters, and they're chanted every morning in Japanese. So what they do is they chant them in historical order, and after each one, they call them daiyosho, which in Japanese is equivalent of Reverend Master or Abbess or Abbot in this case. So every morning it's daiyosho, and I can see some of you are smiling, and it's something you can smile about. But I will say you can really get into the rhythm of doing that, I have found. And then it becomes mesmerizing as you get into that rhythm, and it takes a whole different meaning, chanting those 85 names. And then at some point, you realize that every one of those 85, except maybe the first 6 who are legendary, every one of those 85 were human beings who struggled as you are, as I am, or as each of us is, in this tradition. It's amazing when you start humanizing these people. So it goes down to the 85, like the historical Buddha, he was from the Shakya clan, as many of you may know. So in Japanese translation, his name is Shakyamuni Butsu Daiyosho. Shakya is his clan, Muni means wise man, and Butsu is Buddha, Reverend Master, Daiyosho, and then you go down all of them. And as I said, you start realizing that, woo, every one of these people had their problems. It's quite very beautiful. So it isn't just, sometimes it's boring, but it can be really beautiful. So coming back to that, I think another point I want to make about it is, when you chant these, you also realize that of those 85 names in the ancestral line, 84 of them are men. The one and only woman is Reverend Master Jiyu Kennett. She's it. It's like, wow. These days, women are taking note of the patriarchy. And they're saying, wait a minute. This is really off balance here. And here is a really wonderful book. It's called Women of the Way, Discovering 2,500 Years of Buddhist Wisdom, talking about women in the Zen tradition in particular, is what Sally Teasdale does. She tells the story of how this book was written. It's deeply researched. And what she did is she objected to this ancestral lineage, all men. And she went some years ago to the monastery that was established by Dogen was the Zenji, a Japanese 12th century who had gone to China, brought Zen from China to Japan, established a monastery, name is Eiheiji. 800 years old, that monastery now. It is active, it's big, it's beautiful. She talked about it. All women, all men. So she said she asked the monk who was kind of guiding them around. She knew the answers, but she said she asked the monk, "So are women allowed here?" And he said, "Well," she points out, Japanese don't like to say no or yes out loud. "Well," he hemmed and hawed, and he said, "Well, no." And then she said, and she knew the answer, "Well, why not?" And then he hemmed and hawed some more. And then he said, "Because we didn't have time to build bathrooms for women." And she said, she burst into tears. She said she utterly surprised herself. She had no idea she had such a sense of unfairness about it all, that right at that moment she just burst into tears. And that was the reason why she decided to do the research, write this book. She came up with 14 women, historically verified, who knows how many others, but 14. So what she is doing in here is trying to establish, is establishing a lineage of women of the way, as well as those of men. So to go back to Jiu Kennet now, and I would like to say, certainly at Shasta Abbey, there is every effort to, there's no discrimination. I mean, she was the abbess, and today the person who is another is abbess is also a woman. So it's not like that anymore there. But she experienced considerable discrimination when she was in Japan, and most of the monks there did not take her seriously. Fortunately, the abbot of that monastery in Japan where she trained did. The discrimination became so intense that at one point she asked the abbot, she said, "Let me go to a woman's monastery." I don't know if they call them a nunnery in Japanese, but she said, "Let me go and train with women." And he said, no. He said if she went and trained with women, then later on she would never be taken as seriously as if she trained and made it through with the men. So she stayed, she trained in the monastery, and yeah, she established her own. She established her own. Discrimination was only one of the problems there. Diet was another. The staple Japanese diet at that monastery was rice and pickles, and obviously not well balanced. She developed diabetes there that over the decades grew worse and worse. By the time I lived at the monastery in the 90s, she spent her summers up in a cooler area because it can be really hot in the summer there at Mount Shasta. And so she spent her summers in Oregon at a cooler spot, came back for the winters and spent most of the time indoors at Shasta Abbey. I seldom saw her when I was there. She died in 1996, Reverend Master Jiu did, and I was there at the time when she died. And it was an incredibly sad and intense time. The tenor of Abbey life just shifted radically at the time. The ceremony that was marked her death was postponed for a while because there's an abbey also in the UK, in England, a sister abbey, and they wanted to leave time for the monks from the UK to come to California to be there for this ceremony. She had established that as well. So during those days in between, before the ceremony, what they did was the bell in the abbey tolled every hour, 24 hours a day. So such a heavy time, such a time of great grief. So I wrote a poem about this, and I'm going to read it to you now, because I found it an unforgettable period, and anybody else who was there at the time did too. And first of all, I'll just say a few things about terms, because there'll be a few terms you won't know, probably. And one is, I use the term Avalokiteshvara, long word. It's Sanskrit for Guanyin. Some of you know the Bodhisattva, the being of compassion. The Sanskrit is Avalokiteshvara. They have an Avalokiteshvara shrine, and they tend to use that, or they use the Japanese, which I won't tell you the Japanese. We won't get too many languages here. I also use the term Daio Kyogen. He was one of the ancestors in the Shasta Abbey ancestral line. There are enormous literature about who the ancestors were. So I mention him in this poem. And then I mention the sound of passing cars in the poem. So that is I-5, right? So now you're clued in, so enough to understand what's all this about. So I call it the death of Reverend Master G.U. Kennett. She died on 1996. And then I start with a little blurb that explains something. And it said, center in Shasta Abbey's Shrine of Compassion is a glass engraving lit from behind, depicting the gracefully robed, many-armed figure of Avalokiteshvara, the Buddhist embodiment of compassion. All lines seem to entwine in blessing. So now the poem. The temple bell sounds on the hour. It's a neutral noise to those in passing cars. A horn honking in the distance. The drone of tires on the road. Same thing. But to the monks within, the bell tolls the death of the abbess. An event so profound, it balks at generalities. 85 times, dating back to the Buddha himself, an ancestor in this line has died. 85 beings, each leaving teachings whose collective reach branches in an intricate canopy across old cultures to ours, offering peace to seekers like me, maybe to you too. On this 85th death, the dark ribbon of the bell's voice binds monks together and apart in grief, as disciples were likely bound, for example, by the voice of Daio Kyogen, the 43rd ancestor, who mounted his meditation platform at age 82, said farewell, and died. Surely some knew beforehand. Surely watching their master ascend his seat and leading into his voice, they dreaded what must follow. Did any wish to put out a hand to stop him, as if to forestall death? The ribbon of sound that now wraps round abbey monks enfolds other temple residents too, human and not. Cats, dogs, the dwarf lemon tree in the greenhouse, which bears a record 62 lemons. A pink moth lodges on the ceremony hall door, as though seeking refuge. Despite a thorough temple cleaning, this smallest of us is not removed. No more fragile in its way than humans in theirs, the moth has made a choice, and the choice is respected. 3 days on the door, and then gone. Flown, perhaps, or killed by an overnight frost. Another death in the temple, this one unobserved. The night of Reverend Master's death, I dreamt my father was dying. Stepping from his room out in the frosty air, I saw in my dream a lacework of bare branches, each enveloped in a clear and shimmering aura, in which were etched figures of such grace, I called to him to come and see the beauty. Thank you.